Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to The View Up Here. I'm your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is December 12th, 2018. Tonight, the Montreal First Liars Conference. Much ado about not much. First Ministers Conference. A wonderfully Canadian creation where provincial and territorial premiers try to use their 13-to-1 advantage to extort, persuade, embarrass, browbeat the federal government in delivering on aims not necessarily in the national interest, despite all claims to the contrary. There's no real purpose in these gatherings in reality. Federal governance is determined by the House of Commons, where all voters in Canada have a say, in theory. Provincial and territorial governance is determined by voters in those specific jurisdictions only, under the same premise. Nothing at these events could not be accomplished via teleconference, administrative cooperation, and or smaller meetings based on actual solutions being proposed and debated. But that would do little to tackle the main purpose, which is politics. Where else can a premier get the national spotlight to pitch their specific pet project or peeve to the voters at home and from coast to coast to coast? The premise of common goals allows all attendees to speak on their angle and try to convince everyone that it is a national cause. That's the true purpose of the First Liars Conference. Rachel Notley spending tax dollars for her TMX propaganda campaign en français. Doug Ford threatening not to show because he's Doug Ford. Scott Moe hating everything and proposing nothing. Blaine Higgs leaving no doubt where he worked for over 2 decades, and Brian Pallister trying to head off the next hydro dam PR disaster because it's an opportunity, you see. And rookie Francois Legault making it clear he represents Quebec and everyone else can pound sand with a smile. Now, the end of conference communique, which was signed by all 14 parties, looked conspicuously like the original federal agenda, despite the apparent unacceptability of it for most of the week prior to the event. Well, show's over. Carry on, subjects. Now, before we get going, everybody saw enough about the First Ministers Conference. They saw a lot more before it than during or after it, that's for sure, because, that's where the quote-unquote news is, apparently. But I want you to think about this, whether it was reading a paper or television. Do you have any idea who all these premiers are? 13 of them? I think I got 9. That's it, topped out. So before we get going, I'm just going to read the names of all the ministers that were there, just so, a couple of them get their name heard somewhere, because they were invisible, according to media. Representing the federal government, of course, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. I'm going to list party affiliations for all of them because there's a point to that too. Of course, he is the Liberal Party of Canada. British Columbia, John Horgan, New Democratic Party of BC. Alberta, Rachel Notley, New Democratic Party of Alberta. Saskatchewan, Scott Moe, Saskatchewan Party. Manitoba, Brian Pallister, Progressive Conservative Party of Manitoba. Ontario, Doug Ford, Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario. Quebec, François Legault, Coalition Avenir Quebec. Nova Scotia, Stephen McNeil, the Liberal Party in Nova Scotia. New Brunswick, Blaine Higgs, Progressive Conservative Party in New Brunswick. Prince Edward Island, Wade McLaughlin, the PEI Liberal Party. Newfoundland and Labrador, Dwight Ball, Liberal Party of Newfoundland and Labrador. Northwest Territories, Bob McLeod. There are no parties in the Northwest Territories. Mr. McLeod is the Premier by consensus. Imagine that. Yukon Territory, Sandy Silver, Yukon Liberal Party. Nunavut, Joe Saviga Katak. Also no parties in Nunavut by consensus. Premier, if I got your name wrong, I'm sorry. Remember before it started, in the Great Hype period, well, there's, this goes back to the Maclean's cover of the Resistance. Oh, it's way different than last time, boy. Oh, Trudeau's up shit creek this time. Look at all these conservatives ganging up on him. Well, if you go down this list, okay, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, New Brunswick. That's it. 4 conservative provinces. Yukon, Newfoundland, PEI, Nova Scotia, and the federal government, all Liberal. BC and Alberta, NDP. And, of course, Quebec is Quebec. So where's this big war? Where's this big army against Trudeau? This is a First Minister's Conference. It's not an election. Everybody's got one vote, one say. So whoop-de-doo. That's just a side detail that was really picking my ass, so I wanted to go over that. But we're going to stick with what happened in the week leading up. I'll give you a tip. We're going to find out at the end of the show that my opinion of this whole exercise of these meetings, First Minister conferences, is going to agree with someone I wish it didn't. But it does, but we'll get there. But in the week leading up, a couple days before Rachel Notley left, in the Edmonton Journal, Janet French, this would be the day before the conference, I believe, anyway, the 6th, Alberta government advertisements spelling out Canada's lost oil revenues will splash over Montreal in red ink this weekend as the nation's premiers meet in that city. The Alberta government took the unprecedented step of advertising during the First Minister's meeting to remind people and premiers that denying access to Tidewater costs Canada's economy $80 million a day, said a government press release. Yeah, right. The provincial government is spending $84,000 on print ads in the Montreal Gazette, Star Metro Montreal, and Le Devoir, extensive homepage presences on the paper's websites, and projecting advertisements onto the sides of nearly 20 central Montreal buildings. Alberta's challenges are national challenges, and Albertans expect their government to make that case every chance it can, Premier Notley said in the press release. We're not going to stop until the pipeline is built to keep Canada working. The print advertisements will run Friday and Saturday, and the projections will be visible until Sunday. The Gazette ad says the paralysis afflicting the Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion Project means less funding for infrastructure, less investment in green energy, and fewer Canadian jobs. It says increased pipeline capacity should be a priority for the premiers as they meet. It's just like watching Edmonton television. Everybody got it last week. Notley said she'll have allies in the room to help push talks on the oil price crisis at the premiers' meeting, despite its absence from the formal agenda. There is really no province in the country that doesn't owe Alberta to some degree for their schools, their hospitals, their roads. The fact of the matter is Alberta has to do well for Canada to do well, Notley said in Edmonton before leaving for Montreal. She said forecasts for Canada's economic growth are already more muted because of the low price Alberta is getting for its oil in the United States and its inability to move its product to ports for shipment overseas. Notley also said she doesn't want to spend time listening to what the federal government says it is already doing to try to address Alberta's concerns. We don't need federal ministers to explain to us what they've already done. We are capable of reading their press releases. Oh, snap. Rachel Notley's a quick learner, isn't she? So you imagine how that played here in Alberta. You know, have her supposed Lougheed moment or something. Play it up. But by no means was she the only one. This is also from just before the conference. CBC, Janice McGregor. It's an overall look at what the story was for what this contentious conference was going to be all about. And the title of it is Doug Ford Threatens Walkout as Provincial Officials Criticize Agenda for First Minister's Conference. As Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the premiers of the provinces and territories gathered for talks in Montreal, bickering over the meeting's agenda escalated to the point where it threatened to overwhelm the agenda itself. Ontario Premier Doug Ford's people suggested he might walk out of the meeting early if his concerns aren't addressed. No one should assume the Premier of Ontario is prepared to spend his Friday sitting through a series of lectures from federal cabinet ministers. We are considering our options. We hope it doesn't come to that. That's from a senior official in Ford's office. The agenda for the meeting, originally intended to be a stocktaking on a range of economic and trade issues, including the recently signed revised North American Trade Agreement, USMCA, and stalled efforts to reduce internal trade barriers, is now the focus of a dispute that threatens to overshadow policy discussions. As it stands right now, the agenda is one we are not happy with, said the official in Ford's office. And certainly we are leaving our options open to how we respond if the Prime Minister digs his heels in. Just before Trudeau and Ford met privately in Montreal this afternoon, so this would be on, December 6th, both men spoke briefly to gathered journalists. Ford said he was looking forward to FaceTime with the Prime Minister so he could voice some of his concerns. The tariffs right now, the aluminum and steel tariffs that are hurting our automotive sector, which plays a massive factor in our economy in Ontario, along with the internal trade between all the provinces, Ford said. As a lot of people know, it's easier to trade south of the border than it is between the provinces. According to federal sources, Ford told Trudeau in their private meeting that Canada should unilaterally remove its tariffs on American goods, imposed as retaliation for the U.S. metals tariffs, so that the U.S. could follow suit. The sources also say that Ford asked Trudeau to scrap Bill C-69, the federal government's legislation to revamp the environmental assessment process, but suggested no alternatives. After the meeting, a spokesperson for Ford told reporters the Premier has high hopes for the meeting between Trudeau and the Premiers Friday morning. The Premier is hopeful that Prime Minister Trudeau is ready to sit down and have a meaningful discussion with his provincial counterparts about important national issues. On Thursday evening, the Premiers and Trudeau took in an informal dinner at a Montreal souvlaki restaurant that saw Canada's ambassador to the United States, David McNaughton, drop by to say hello. While he was there, the CBC asked him about the prospect of unilaterally dropping tariffs against the U.S., to which he replied, "I wouldn't advise that." Speaking to reporters Thursday afternoon, Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe said he did not come to the meeting with the intention of walking out, but rather was hoping to have a collaborative conversation that he hoped would come to some solutions. We'll be looking for the scrapping of Bill C-69, a bill that will ensure there will be no more pipelines built in Canada, there will be no more industrial development in Canada. To ensure and allow provinces to enact their own carbon plans rather than have the federal government impose a carbon tax. On Tuesday, 3 days before the conference, Moe and Alberta Premier Rachel Notley wrote to Trudeau asking that the crisis facing the energy industry be added to the agenda. The PMO told CBC News that the energy crisis would fit in with the planned discussion. Provincial officials in Alberta told CBC News that they want Trudeau and his ministers to listen to their priorities. The draft agenda that was circulated, said one official, had the Prime Minister fitting in a train of his cabinet ministers to lecture the premiers on the topics of his choosing. We don't need federal ministers to explain to us what they've already done, nor do we need to be spending time talking about Apple vodka labels. A direct shot by Notley at a federal move to harmonize vodka labeling, touted in Finance Minister Bill Morneau's fall economic statement. We actually need to talk about things that are actually going to keep people employed in this country and grow economic prosperity. Notley called on other premiers to deal with these issues in a mature, thoughtful, and informed way. So that means that we cut the fluff and we change the agenda. The Alberta Premier declined to comment specifically on Ford's threat to walk out. What we're going to do is take every opportunity to raise the profile of this issue in the most effective way possible. In an interview with CBC News, Northwest Territories Premier Bob McLeod said it's important for premiers to stay in the room and work together as a group. That was a story that all the outlets were selling. Who's going to leave? Who's going to bitch? Who's going to point fingers? And how bad is Trudeau going to look when it's over? Now we're pretty much talking about stuff the day of the conference. There are no cameras in there. You don't get to see what goes on. Everything the media gets is from sources, staffers. So you think there's no bias? You think there's no possibility for some sort of misinformation? Of course there is. Moving on, let's look at a little bit of history of the First Minister's conferences and a little bit of a focus on Doug Ford from Toronto Star and Chantal Hébert. This came out on the 7th, which was after the conference. The last First Minister's conference of Justin Trudeau's current term in office was the most acrimonious. The imminence of a federal and an Alberta election next year certainly contributed to the tensions, but those tensions will outlast next year's federal and provincial votes. Not all the lines that divided the premiers on Friday are drawn in the relatively shallow ground of electoral sand. Whoever is Prime Minister a year from now will find the same irreconcilable provincial differences on carbon pricing and pipelines. Some of those differences find Ontario's Doug Ford and Quebec's François Legault on different sides. The two Central Canada premiers made simultaneous maiden appearances on the First Minister's stage on Friday in Montreal. Now here are some early observations as to how they fit in the current federal-provincial dynamics and what their presence at the table may bode. Among the participants at the gathering, Ford brought the least experience in provincial politics, and it showed. By threatening to walk out over agenda differences with the Prime Minister, he may have hoped to lead a larger boycott of the event, but he found little support for a walkout among his colleagues. Manitoba Premier Brian Pallister, a fellow Tory, spoke for the others when he said on his way in that he had not come all the way to Montreal to bail out at the first opportunity. Now, it's not that premiers have not walked out or boycotted First Ministers' conferences in the past, but it was almost always to underline a serious grievance that had their province up in arms. After Meech Lake failed in 1990, Quebec stayed away from all federal provincial meetings for the better part of 2 years. In 2004, Newfoundland and Labrador Premier Danny Williams left the table, then presided over by Paul Martin, over a quarrel about the equalization formula. By comparison, Ford lacked a substantial motive beyond partisan petulance to justify his threat. There's a reason why most premiers have not over the years found the walkout option to be attractive, and why no Ontario government leader has threatened a boycott in the past. The day in and day out, the Prime Minister, by the sheer virtue of his position, commands the national stage. By comparison, it is not often that a premier gets the opportunity to take on the federal government in front of a Canada-wide audience. Former Newfoundland and Labrador Premier Clyde Wells, who emerged as a key player in the mobilization of public opinion against the Meech Lake Constitutional Accord in the late 80s, certainly made the most of the national exposure those conferences gave him. As she looks to her upcoming re-election campaign, Alberta Premier Rachel Notley is similarly putting her time in the spotlight to maximum use these days. At these gatherings, Ontario is in a league of its own in terms of the influence it yields on national affairs. On that basis, Ford's predecessors rightly felt that it was immensely more productive to throw their weight around at the table than to throw a tantrum for the cameras outside the room. But then they did not amalgamate their role as leader of Canada's most populous province with that of a federal leader of the opposition. As he looks to the next 3 years of his current term in office, Ford may want to ponder the risks of trading Ontario's historical role as a major provincial anchor and a leadership that used to attend it for that of loose cannon. There is, after all, a possibility that Trudeau will be around for as long or longer than the time Ford heads the Ontario government. Quebec's Legault, for his part, will probably never find Trudeau more amenable to his demands than in the period between now and next year's federal election. The federal Liberals are hoping to make up for any seat losses elsewhere in Canada with gains in Quebec next fall. They are not spoiling for a fight with the new premier. When Legault crossed over to the Federalist camp, he brought along a significant number of sovereigntist sympathizers. If only to avoid breathing new life in the Parti Québécois, he has to demonstrate that he can make the CAQ relationship with the federal government work to Quebec's benefit. Premier of Quebec and the Prime Minister have an interest in finding common ground. For now, Legault is content to let his Ontario colleague take over Quebec's habitual role of disturber-in-chief. Thank you, Madame Hébert. Some real logic to the situation. What about the other provinces? What's their angle? We know why Alberta's there. Doug's there because he's Doug. Quebec's hanging out. What about Manitoba? CBC, Ian Froese. Manitoba's Premier Pallister pitches Prime Minister on green pipeline for hydro exports. If the federal government will invest billions to ship crude oil across the country, it should help finance a green pipeline as well, Manitoba Premier Brian Pallister said as premiers met with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Pallister said he received a favorable response from Prime Minister Trudeau when he broached the topic at the First Ministers' meeting. Now is the time to find new Canadian markets for Manitoba's clean hydroelectricity, Pallister said, since the return on its export to American markets is impaired by oversupply. The opportunity in our country for us to make energy available at very reasonable cost to one another has seldom been greater. We've had lots of talk about pipelines and rail cars and so on, shipping oil, but I think the longer-term discussion that needs to be undertaken, and the better one from an environmental standpoint, is to start acting on the concept of a national green pipeline. Specifically, Pallister inquired about Manitoba Hydro's proposed transmission line from Birtle in southwestern Manitoba to the Saskatchewan border. Manitoba Hydro reached a long-term deal with Saskatchewan's power utility earlier this fall to transport as much as 215 megawatts of hydroelectric energy to the province. A final contract should be drawn up by mid-2019. The project, which Pallister estimates would cost between $60 to $65 million, so count on it being around 200, is currently seeking regulatory approvals and would help Saskatchewan wean itself off coal power. This has been raised in the past, in a general sense, but to have the chance to raise it today face-to-face with the Prime Minister of Canada is a good opportunity. It's a good opportunity for us to advance something that can help us. Pallister says he has support from Quebec Premier François Legault, whose province also produces hydroelectricity. Pallister left the meeting in good spirits, telling reporters it wasn't the acrimonious affair some observers predicted it would be. He also discussed slipping health transfers from Ottawa, over-regulation in the oil industry, and the timely completion of flood channels in the Interlake, which the province has warned may be slowed by consultations. In addition, Pallister said the premiers are willing to work together to reduce trade barriers between their respective borders. Pallister actually gave a good quote here. I've been involved with this particular challenge since the 90s, and I can tell you I've seen more progress in the last couple of years than I saw in the first 20. That's about inter-provincial trade. But you notice how Premier Pallister is a professional politician. He didn't piss off Trudeau. He stayed out of picking a side on much anything else. What he did do is take his looming hydroelectric disaster kiosk and trying to sell it as a green project instead of a huge hydroelectric disaster like Muskrat Falls and Site C. But hey, good angle, man. Got to give it to him. Good angle. I do believe the newest premier is Blaine Higgs of New Brunswick. This is post-conference. This is in the National Observer by Giuseppe Valente. Quebec slams door on New Brunswick's pipeline dream. New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs remained optimistic Friday that someday a pipeline would be built to bring Western crude oil to ports in his region for transport overseas. But the Quebec Premier did his best to kill that dream. While the Prime Minister and Canada's premiers found common ground on issues such as trade during their meetings, they were confronted with the harsh reality that Quebec will not accept a pipeline. I understand that Alberta and the other provinces that produce oil want to find ways to get it to Tidewater, but I was very, very clear. There is no social acceptability for a pipeline that would pass through Quebec territory, said Legault. He also saw no contradiction in lobbying premiers Friday to buy more hydroelectricity from his province while rejecting Western energy. We are offering an energy that is not expensive and is clean. I am not embarrassed to refuse dirty energy while we are offering clean energy at a competitive price. That's also from Legault. You see how this is being used now? These huge hydroelectric debt machines are now green. They're the good guy. That's what we owe our money on, so let's shit on the oil guys. TransCanada Pipeline Corporation had proposed the $15.7 billion Energy East pipeline to bring Western crude through Quebec and onwards to New Brunswick before being shipped overseas. The company abandoned the project more than a year ago, and a spokesperson for TCPL recently said it has no plan to revive it. But despite the hurdles placed by TransCanada and Quebec, Higgs told reporters Friday he isn't giving up. This is the first time I've had a discussion with Mr. Legault about the pipeline. I understand the political sensitivities, and the first process for Energy East was a flawed one. But I'm optimistic that if we work together with people in our province and his province and across the nation, that we'll find solutions. Okay, here's where you tell Higgs is part of the Conservative Club right off the bat. This is a very interesting segue they put in here. While he remained hopeful, Higgs also offered a warning. The country is still very much dependent on oil revenues, and if Alberta continues to suffer economically, it will hurt the entire country, regardless of how much hydroelectricity Quebec has. He said New Brunswick continues to receive federal equalization payments, which represent 30% of the province's budget. Quebec is also a major benefactor of equalization, while Alberta remains a have province that subsidizes others. This is a quote from the Premier of New Brunswick. Alberta has been feeding our kids for a long time with the royalties, with the money that has come from oil. My concern is how will the federal government continue to pay? How will transfer payments survive in the current form? Will the next message be that transfer payments need to be cut because the revenue is no longer there? Mr. Higgs, you just demonstrated you've been a premier for what, a month? Equalization formula is based on the income taxes collected in all the provinces. Alberta has the highest per capita income by a fair amount, average. It has the lowest taxation by a wide margin in Canada. So you wonder why Alberta pays so much into equalization? That's why. In Alberta, we make the most on average, and we're taxed the least. The purpose of equalization is to guarantee minimum standards anywhere in Canada. When you have provinces like BC, Alberta, and Ontario, I can tell you right now, on their own, those standards are higher than, Quebec too. But I mean, think about the territories. Think about Saskatchewan. Think about Manitoba. That's what the money's for, and that's how it's collected, and that's how it's distributed. So, Mr. Higgs, quit fucking lying. Let's move on to Quebec. Again from the National Observer. This was December 10th, after the meetings. Giuseppe Valente again. Quebec says Ottawa owes it $300 million for costs related to the refugee influx. Quebec Premier François Legault said he made progress during Friday's First Minister meeting on his demand that the federal government pay $300 million in compensation to cover the cost of refugees arriving in Quebec. Legault said Ottawa had previously offered to cover only the cost of lodging the asylum seekers, which is about half of what Quebec was seeking. This afternoon, they have moved forward a little more to say they are ready to look at other expenses besides lodging, Legault told reporters at the end of the meeting. We will have discussions with the bills between ministers and bureaucrats to get as close as possible to $300 million. It is a lot of money. Since 2017, there's been an influx of asylum seekers entering Quebec across the U.S. border. Legault said it takes more than 18 months for would-be refugees to find out if they can remain in Canada. In the meantime, Quebec pays for their housing, education, and healthcare costs, which have totaled roughly $300 million over 2 years. He said Ottawa is responsible for the lengthy delays in the system. I expect Mr. Trudeau to compensate us. is what he said before the meeting. And look what he said after. Oh, yeah, we made some progress. It's unacceptable for it to take 18 months before asylum seekers get an answer. And in the majority of cases, they are refused because they cannot prove that their life is in danger. Federal authorities processed 24,745 asylum claims made in Quebec alone in 2017, 5 times more than the previous year. And the pace has continued this year with 23,595 claimants in Quebec processed through the end of October. Quebec receives more than half of all claims in Canada. Legault said it is Ottawa's responsibility to pay for the direct costs of asylum seekers. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, opposition members representing Quebec ridings called on the Trudeau government to agree to Legault's request. The request is totally appropriate, and I hope that the government is going to be attentive to this request. NDP Member of Parliament Matthew Dubé. Quebec should not be left with the bill for what was called mistakes and failures of the Prime Minister. Obviously, that's from a Conservative, Pierre Paulhuet. The Bloc also got in on it. Gabrielle Sainte-Marie. Ottawa should be compensating Quebec rather than helping Alberta by rail cars to ship oil. So there we go. Legault played that at home. He brought it up at the federal level. Chantal Hébert covered it, how Trudeau and Legault aren't looking to start any disagreements. He played hardball going in. Then we have the conversations that are basically in a journalistic skiff, and now everybody's happy. And Quebec's getting more money. Isn't that funny how that works? Speaking of Monsieur Legault, it's from the Montreal Gazette, the day after. In the great Canadian family of First Ministers who gathered Friday in Montreal, one man emerged as the happiest of the bunch, the former sovereigntist-turned-nationalist Premier François Legault. Beaming would be a more accurate description. With daggers drawn between several premiers and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau over Ottawa's plan to slap a carbon tax on them to fight climate change, the newly elected Legault wrapped up his first showing in the Canadian club by saying he had a very good day. Not only did he obtain assurances of more federal money to pay for asylum seekers and a promise of aid for Quebec's dairy farmers, but Legault's pitch to sell more of the province's hydro surpluses, a green energy when compared to oil, made him the darling of the event. And the fact he politely said thanks but no thanks to ministers hoping he would allow an oil pipeline, a return of the defunct Energy East project, carry Alberta oil across Quebec to Tidewater and shipment overseas, will endear him with Quebec's surging climate change movement. The icing on the cake? He and Trudeau seemed to click at the dinner of premiers Thursday evening, and the two sat beside each other at the negotiation table where, face it, Trudeau needed a friend in the face of newly elected Conservative premiers. A gang of separatists, is that what you mean? Said the former Parti Québécois cabinet minister when asked if it felt unusual to watch the other leaders ruining Trudeau's party, when in the past Quebec made such headlines. On the environment, Trudeau and I pretty well agreed, Legault said. I think we have proof Quebec has a balanced position. We are pro-environment, pro-economic development. I sensed there were many people who wanted to have me in their camp. Legault was asked if he was Trudeau's new best friend. I wouldn't say that because, as you know, I am more a defender of provincial autonomy. But Legault rode with the punches, showing empathy too, particularly for Alberta Premier Rachel Notley. That situation has plunged the oil patch into crisis, and Notley wants help from Ottawa. Quebec faces a similar stranded energy predicament with its hydroelectric surpluses, which Legault is trying to peddle east, west, and south. Hydro-Quebec's problem is getting new power lines approved in the United States. He said he wants to make Ontario an offer it can't refuse. Cheap, clean power as an alternative to spending $20 billion retooling aging nuclear generating plants. The big advantage we have is that our energy costs less and is clean. On the other hand, he made no apologies for saying no to New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs, who asked Legault to reconsider his refusal to consider a new pipeline across Quebec. So that's what they're saying in Montreal. Notice how they're making hydroelectric the green energy. From Manitoba, from Quebec, it will happen in Newfoundland with Muskrat Falls. BC will get on that bandwagon sooner or later too, if the Site C garbage keeps going. Everything else I'm going to talk about is post, and it's more about, hey, remember all that stuff we were saying before it happened? Yeah, well, this is kind of what happened. I found it really interesting how, like I said, some premiers, some provinces were not even mentioned at all nationally, and depending on where you lived, I'm curious, people in Ontario, did you hear about any other provinces before the First Minister's Conference besides whatever the hell Ford was going to do? You might have heard about Alberta. Nobody heard nothing about BC, which is really weird. So what I did is I went through and made a little list because, every one of these premiers talked to the press from their province or territory. That's the whole point of going here. It's like red carpet for politicians. So I made a little list of what they all tried to get across back home. We'll start with Scott Moe from Saskatchewan. Something he brought up that didn't really seem to get reflected anywhere nationally was the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal case against the carbon tax. Good luck with that. C-69, as I quoted before, he's nuts. There'll never be another pipeline, never be another industrial development, ever. He wants a new environmental assessment that will work for industries. That's what he said. He wants provincial jurisdiction to supersede federal jurisdiction on the environment. Well, that's a good trick when you sign international agreements, Scotty. And we need the proper regulatory framework for approvals. So what we have now. There were some ministers who did speak at the conference. One of them was Minister of Environment, Catherine McKenna. Basically, all she had to say was Doug Ford's nuts. She said Ontario has no credible plan. Ontario's plan would pay polluters not to pollute. Backwards. What did Ford specifically say? The goalposts have moved. The goalposts have moved. Okay, we'll get to that. Just be scared, blah, blah. Premier McNeil from Nova Scotia was positive, optimistic. He's on Team Liberal. When he was asked whether the way Doug Ford described things was correct, Premier McNeil said that that was not his interpretation of what the Prime Minister said. As far as the carbon plan goes federally, Premier McNeil said Trudeau has not changed his speech on it or his methods on it since he brought them up in Vancouver the last time this happened. Rachel Notley's main point was to maintain the ability to sell our product. Does anybody want it is another question. Oh, sorry. John Horgan in BC. Horgan made jokes that he was there with all his friends. Such a great idea. He did say he had a good one-on-one with the Prime Minister talking about the opiate problem, salmon fisheries, and tankers. Premier Horgan said there was far more agreement than disagreement. Carbon pricing is not bad for the economy, as BC's had a carbon tax for over 10 years. He pushed Site C, lumping it in with Hydro-Quebec, Muskrat Falls, Kiosk. Yeah, we got Green Highway too. Electrify, electrify, electrify. Yeah, I bet. We know what Brian Pallister from Manitoba said. Blaine Higgs, well, he did work for Irving Oil for over 20 years, so what do you expect? Now, what did the Prime Minister say in the post-conference presser? He talked about C-69. He said the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 2012 is a failure. C-69 will improve on this and create a new regime. There will be, according to the Prime Minister, with C-69, there will be a clear process, shorter timelines, certainty, unicorns, rainbows. The communique that is put out by the federal government at the end of the conference had approval from all 14 parties. So everybody signed on. Wow, what an acrimonious, explosive meeting. Moving on. This is from the CBC. This is Janice McGregor. Premiers vent over climate goalposts and internal trade. The bluster leading up to Trudeau's fourth First Minister's meeting did not translate into any dramatic showdowns. But as the talks wrapped up in Montreal Friday, it became clear this tension didn't lend itself to any tangible process either. Several days of public bickering over the agenda, including a threat from Ontario Premier Doug Ford to walk out, seemed to simmer down when the leaders actually got into a room together. Sources told CBC News Ford spoke very little during the day-long meeting, as cameras caught him smiling and saying things were fantastic. Prime Minister met early Friday morning with national Indigenous leaders before the premiers joined the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis leaders for a larger discussion of their economic development issues. Isn't that interesting how the national media tells us when that's over? I had no idea that was going on. Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc, Environment Minister Catherine McKenna, Finance Minister Bill Morneau, and Canada's Ambassador to the United States, David McNaughton, joined the group this morning for 6 hours of talks on economic and trade issues. Cameras were invited into the room briefly to record opening remarks from Trudeau, who, of course, touted his government's record on job creation and economic growth and its efforts to protect the environment and unicorns and rainbows and socks. Pollution should not be free anywhere in Canada, he said, as several premiers who adamantly opposed the federal carbon pricing strategy looked on. Trudeau praised Quebec's cap-and-trade system for reducing emissions in Quebec. Oh, it's that Legault guy. What a coincidence. The biggest disagreement that emerged from the talks seemed to come more from confusion than controversy. The Ford government's decision to end its cap-and-trade system has affected Canada's overall math for meeting its 2015 commitment to the UN's Climate Change Convention in Paris to cut carbon emissions by 30% by 2030. The previous Ontario government had committed to a 37% cut in emissions, but the new Ford government's plan will only curb Ontario emissions by 30%. The difference has to be made up somewhere, a fact noted by Trudeau when, according to people in the room at the time, he told the premiers that some provinces are going to exceed their targets. And if it's possible for Ontario to exceed 30% without bringing in a carbon tax, it should do so. Other provinces, Trudeau reportedly said, will not hit 30%. He may have been referring to Alberta. Figure. The Prime Minister's remarks were interpreted by Ford and Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe as the federal government changing its demands on provincial governments and asking some to do more. All of a sudden, the goalpost got changed, said Ford. That creates uncertainty. We're going to keep our side of the bargain. We're now asking the Prime Minister to keep his side. Somebody want to tell Doug that Ontario was committed to 37? Environment Minister Catherine McKenna told reporters, "We did not move the goalposts." Other premiers, including Nova Scotia Premier Stephen McNeil, agreed with McKenna that Trudeau wasn't asking some provinces to exceed their emissions reduction targets. Nova Scotia, McNeil said, is on track to exceed the 30% target. Trudeau said Premier Ford put forward a plan that is a step backwards. Canada's targets are national targets, even though the Premier may wish to play games with numbers. If anyone is moving the goalposts, it's Premier Ford. Trudeau said later that all the premiers expressed a desire to protect the environment, but disagree on how to do it. That's an awesome metaphor. I got to remember that. All parties agreed that, people shouldn't needlessly be killed, but they disagree on how to do it. Ford, Moe, and New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs, all of whom opposed the federal government's carbon pricing strategy, collaborated on strategy ahead of the conference. Other premiers, like BC's John Horgan, remained supportive of carbon pricing, while other premiers like McNeil have come around to the federal climate strategy despite initial concerns. Several premiers made it clear going into the meeting that they were not interested in being lectured by Trudeau or any of his ministers. A source in the room told CBC News that at one point, New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs interrupted Minister Morneau's presentation to suggest he take questions. Morneau answered one question, then carried on speaking. Higgs later told reporters he didn't think he was being lectured and felt positive about how things were going. People presented a few issues that we need to continue to work on, Morneau told reporters, describing the ambience as good and the premiers, including Ford, as leaning in, engaged, and working constructively during his one-hour session with them. When the discussion turned to energy issues, such as pipelines and Bill C-69, the Trudeau government's legislation to change the environmental assessment process to approve future projects, premiers expressed a fear that the federal cabinet's veto power will deter future investments. Some premiers said they want C-69 repealed. Others disagreed, saying the old system was worse. That's interesting. That's a new spin I haven't really heard before. The fear is that the federal cabinet will say no when the new approval process says yes, that's what they're going to try and sell? That's ridiculous. You mean just like how the current government has told the NEB that they expect to approve a permit once they get their recommendation? Yeah, oh yeah, I can see the cabinet saying no when the authority says yes. Oh yeah. Ridiculous. Notice how they're staying away from talking about the environment. They don't want to talk about the tanker traffic right now. All kinds of stuff. And it's not just provincial on that level, obviously. There is collaboration. Inter-provincial trade barriers were supposed to be the original focus of this gathering. But the premiers don't appear to have done much on this file since they last met in July. Quebec was chairing the Committee on Internal Trade before the October election that replaced Philippe Couillard's Liberals with the CAQ government under François Legault. A new minister is now in the chair. Efforts to harmonize regulations for the trucking industry have moved forward, but on other files, such as liberalizing alcohol sales, the provinces seem to be digging in their heels. Premier McNeil of Nova Scotia, one of two premiers tasked with the alcohol file coming out of the premiers' talks last July, issued a news release outlining several moves his province was making to facilitate internal trade, including removing personal exemption limits on alcohol transported into Nova Scotia for personal consumption. Well, yeah, you get taken to court, federal court. I could see maybe you'd want to make that go away. The premiers tried, but failed to draft a joint announcement on alcohol exemption limits last summer. Manitoba Premier Brian Pallister, the other premier working with McNeil on trade issues, said 9 provinces are ready to end these exemption limits, but the other provinces haven't agreed to opt out publicly, so the rest can move forward. Perfection is the enemy of the good, Pallister said, lamenting that other priorities keep taking precedence and standing in the way of progress on issues that should have been settled 30 years ago. I would have to agree with Premier Pallister on that point. I can remember the Mulroney government talking about eliminating inter-provincial trade barriers. That is, in fact, 30 years ago. Instead of these trade issues, Alberta Premier Rachel Notley and Saskatchewan's Premier Moe went public with a letter prior to the event demanding a focus on the energy crisis. Canada's energy sector is being crippled by rock-bottom prices for Canadian oil and pipeline bottlenecks frustrating efforts to sell Canadian petroleum products in new markets that do not exist. As we all know, the federal government purchased the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project earlier this year, but a renewed consultation effort to secure approval for the project is not guaranteed to succeed. Yeah, okay. Who wrote this again? CBC. Okay, that makes sense. In the meantime, Notley is moving to purchase extra freight cars to move more oil by rail. Well, that should be tanker cars. A plan Trudeau seemed willing to consider getting involved in. Notley reminded reporters that it only makes sense for Canada to be more strategic about how it uses its oil resources. Although no solutions resulted from the conference, she expressed satisfaction with having raised the profile of the issue. National Post, Moira Forest. During a press conference Friday evening at the end of the conference, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said the meeting had been an opportunity to discuss our common priorities, like the need to grow the Canadian economy and to create good, well-paid jobs for the middle class. Trudeau had promised during the 2015 election to hold annual First Ministers' meetings, a change from the former Harper government. But with a growing chorus of provincial premiers who oppose the federal government on issues ranging from carbon pricing to support for asylum seekers, it seemed this year's meeting was likely to feature more discord than in years past. But by the end of the day on Friday, most premiers said the meetings had been productive and seemed to feel their concerns had been heard. They all signed a joint communiqué that said they had discussed ways to collaborate to help grow the economy. Still, there was little tangible progress on any of the province's major concerns. Notley said, "We definitely raised the profile of the issue, but we don't have the answer yet. I've got to be frank on that." Oh, that's so revealing. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe emerged from the meeting to say Trudeau had made a commitment to work with the provinces on the regulations for Bill C-69, the Liberal government's new environmental assessment legislation currently before the Senate. Alberta and Saskatchewan are especially concerned about the bill and claim it will throw up more barriers for major resource projects. But all Trudeau really said was that he's looking forward to the Senate's work on the bill. That's it. Mo is, I don't know, Mo can't understand English or what. Ahead of the meeting, reports suggested that Ontario Premier Doug Ford might walk out in protest, possibly taking other premiers with him. But by Friday morning, before the conference began, provincial officials were making it clear no such plan was in the works, saying it was never his goal to leave. Now this is interesting. Granted, this may be the lightest of weight for all the ministers there, no offense meant. Prince Edward Island Premier Wade McLaughlin had predicted that no premier would walk out, injecting a little perspective into a day otherwise consumed by political posturing. Said Premier McLaughlin, "We are not in an existential crisis in this country today. We know what the challenges are for our country. We know what our responsibilities are. And frankly, we know how we can work together and move forward." And notice what he said there. And frankly, we can work together. So, politics. A politician giving up the game. Or maybe he's just saying, hate the game, not the player. Okay, here's another one from after, and this is from the city that hosted it. This is from the Montreal Gazette. This is where I got it. It's a Canadian Press article. Now, remember how we saw and how I mentioned that the big print and television were telling us what a slobber knocker this one was going to be. So many things could go wrong. Then it was a snooze fest as usual. So, what do they say the day after it? Prime Minister Justin Trudeau managed to keep the peace at what began as a tension-filled First Ministers' meeting Friday, but had few concrete achievements to show for the day-long gathering. The one sour note was sounded by Ontario's PC Premier, Doug Ford, who accused Trudeau of moving the goalposts on Canada's climate change plans, requiring Ontario to cut its greenhouse gas emissions more than Ford had expected. But other premiers, including fellow Conservative Brian Pallister from Manitoba, disputed Ford's interpretation of what the Prime Minister said. Everything was discussed, said Blaine Higgs. I was encouraged by the kind of no-holds-barred discussion. That's what we wanted, and that's what we got. Higgs, who had never attended a First Minister's meeting before, said many of the others said this was one of the most productive meetings they've been in for a long time. Trudeau and all the premiers, including Ford, signed on to a final communique that was long on general statements about working collaboratively to create jobs, grow the economy, protect the environment, reduce red tape, knock down barriers to trade between provinces, and unicorns and rainbows and socks. The communique says all agreed that the federal government should invest in short-term support for energy businesses hammered by the price differential for Alberta's oil. The federal government should also invest in medium-term efforts to get energy products to market, which of course Rachel Notley took as supporting her plan to buy tanker cars, as well as long-term efforts to build the infrastructure, presumably pipelines, needed to get oil and gas to Tidewater. The communique acknowledged that while all First Ministers agree on reducing carbon emissions, they disagree on how to go about it. 4 Conservative premiers, Ford of Ontario, Moe of Saskatchewan, Higgs of New Brunswick, and Pallister of Manitoba, are going to court to challenge the federal plan to impose a price on carbon in their provinces starting in the new year. Federal officials pointed out that 30% is a national target and that under the Pan-Canadian Climate Change Accord, provinces agreed to varying reductions to reach that goal. Nova Scotia Premier Stephen McNeil said all Trudeau said during the meeting was that some provinces will cut emissions more than others, not that they will be required to do so. Although Ford had been at the center of demands to expand the agenda for the meeting, sources say neither he nor any member of his team was in the room when one of the issues he'd insisted upon, the influx of irregular border crossers, was discussed. Despite some of the pre-meeting theatrics, sources who were not authorized to speak publicly also said Ford spoke only several times during the meeting and did not bother to use his translation device when French was spoken. All right. How's that canceling the French University doing? Dougie, are you listening, Ontario? See, again, here's the conflict. Here's the total spin. At least I will say that this article from the Canadian Press has both spin on the same issue. Among the few concrete results to emerge from the meeting, Premier Moe said Prime Minister Trudeau committed to amending Bill C-69, legislation to beef up environmental assessments for energy projects. The bill has been heavily criticized for creating regulatory hurdles and uncertainty that will scare off investors in things like pipelines. Bill C-69 has just passed second reading in the Senate. If the Senate does not amend it and passes it, it will receive royal assent and become law. If the Senate amends it, which is very likely, and passes it on third reading, then it goes back to the House, and they will have to vote on whether to accept those amendments or screw around with it some more. And if they don't accept what the Senate tells them right off, then it's got to go back to the Senate again. So for Mo to say that Trudeau has committed to amending Bill C-69, it's not possible. The guy's an idiot. Trudeau would not specify what changes he's willing to make, but said there needs to be clearer and faster timelines so businesses can have certainty and elimination of overlapping federal and provincial assessments. He noted that the bill is currently before the Senate and said he looks forward to any amendments the upper house may make. A spokesman for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce said that while the group was happy to hear the government was willing to make changes to Bill C-69, it had hoped for more concrete action on issues affecting the oil and gas sector. Could somebody tell me why the Canadian Chamber of Commerce is carrying Caps water at a First Minister's conference? Phil Taylor said the Premier should have promised not to block inter-provincial energy and infrastructure projects, such as pipelines, that originate outside of their jurisdiction. Mr. Taylor, do you have any idea what the Constitution is? Or that's not in the boardroom? Mr. Taylor is telling people like Premier Legault that he should just give up his constitutional rights. On inter-provincial trade barriers, the First Ministers agreed to what the communiqué called bold steps, harmonizing standards in the trucking sector, including tire size and size and weight restrictions, and eliminating duplication in federal and provincial food safety regimes. Pallister, who's been crusading to reduce internal trade barriers for years, was thrilled to finally see some modest process. Premier Pallister said, "Each of these things on their own doesn't sound like a big deal, but they add up, and there are literally hundreds and hundreds of these types of impediments to our ability to do business with each other, and they shouldn't be there." That kind of makes it sound like at one time it was like just one part of the country made everything, and they controlled how shit went back and forth. Gee, I wonder how that could be. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you about the communique that they actually signed. And this is the statement at the end of the conference that all 14 parties agreed to, everybody signed, and it sounds an awful lot like the original agenda before all the bullshit started. Montreal, Quebec, December 7th, 2018. Canada's First Ministers met today to discuss ways to strengthen economic growth and create jobs for the middle class by diversifying Canada's international trade, promoting clean growth, and strengthening trade between provinces and territories. Following the meeting, First Ministers issued the following joint communiqué. The first paragraph is basically what I already said. First Ministers discussed the need to diversify trade and the importance of working together to strengthen alignment of federal, provincial, and territorial measures to create jobs. First Ministers agreed to continue to work together to develop complementary initiatives to strengthen the competitiveness of the Canadian economy and to help businesses grow. First Ministers discussed how the new North American Free Trade Agreement will create jobs, strengthen economic ties, and expand Canada's trade in North America. First Ministers agreed on the need to resolve the question of softwood lumber and steel and aluminum tariffs, and to ensure that the federal government supports and fully compensates the supply-managed sector. As First Ministers, we have agreed to collaborate on ways to promote clean growth while growing the economy. As a next step, First Ministers agreed to lead a discussion on the development of a framework. Oh, wow. Enough layers there? First Ministers agreed to lead a discussion on the development of a framework for a clean electric future, including hydroelectricity, aimed at using clean, reliable, and affordable electricity and to promote access to domestic and international markets. First Ministers also agreed on the necessity to ensure all projects have social responsibility and are supported by a science-based process. First Ministers also agreed on the importance of getting remote communities off diesel. First Ministers agreed that interested jurisdictions could explore opportunities for utility corridors in Canada. The next long paragraph is about price differential. Oh my God, oh my God. First Ministers agree that the federal government needs to invest in short-term support for energy sectors impacted by the differential, medium-term efforts to get energy products to market, and long-term efforts to build energy infrastructure that will expand markets and that will reduce the cost of shipping. Sure, it's called a subsidy. A clean and healthy environment is an objective shared by all First Ministers. First Ministers expressed a difference of opinion on Canada's approach to putting a price on pollution. First Ministers also agreed to share information and work collaboratively to ensure that the implementation of proposed changes to how major projects are assessed respect provincial, territorial, and federal jurisdiction and strive for the goal of one project, one review. Okay, I just want to stop for a second because there's only one way you're ever going to guarantee one project, one review, and that's if it's a federal program. That's it. And I'm sure this is an issue as well with First Nations. How can there ever be one review? There's always going to be problems. First Ministers also agreed that continued collaboration and meaningful engagement is important, including on supporting regulations and policies, to support business certainty, and to ensure that good projects go forward in a clear, timely, and transparent process. First Ministers also agreed on the importance of strengthening trade between provinces and territories in order to foster economic growth and improve the everyday lives of Canadians. As First Ministers, we agreed to accelerate work to address domestic barriers to trade that increase business costs and impose needless burden on Canadian firms. The Canadian Free Trade Agreement came into force in July 2017. Since that time, we have taken important steps to ensure that the agreement reduces barriers to the free movement of persons, goods, services, and investments within Canada. Today, we are committing to taking bold steps to further strengthen Canada's economic union. So then they go point by point on what they actually did accomplish. But it just sounds to me, one thing failed with 9 out of 10. Everything else got through. So it's not like they didn't know what was happening before they got there. The harmonized standards in the trucking sector, strengthen the agri-food sector, including clear rules for organic products, continue to work collaboratively with the territories to support their food industries and build food security. Yes, important. The Inter-Provincial alcohol stuff, accelerate work to strengthen the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. Blah, blah, blah. So that's what the official statement of what happened in Montreal was. It sounds pretty much exactly, if you go to the last page and a bit, where it says, this is what we did. These are the things that changed today. It's all interprovincial trade. There's nothing else. Nothing. Red carpet for politicians. Now, as I said, when all is said and done, spectacle's over, carry on. I was looking around to see who out there in the quote-unquote professional media world would have comments that I could relate to on what I thought of this exercise. I found it a little surprised, but hey, the words speak for themselves. National Post, Andrew Coyne. A semi-annual opportunity for premiers to strut and preen and accomplish nothing. What is the point of a First Ministers' Conference? The first such meeting was not held until 1906. Just 10 more Dominion provincial conferences occurred over the next 40 years. Not until the 1950s did they become the semi-annual affairs we know today. That this was also when the TV cameras arrived is possibly not coincidental. If there were actual business to transact, it could just as easily be arranged by subordinates, or over the phone, or via video conference. Or if an issue were so thorny that it genuinely required a fleshly first ministerial encounter, the Prime Minister could always meet bilaterally with the Premier or Premiers involved, as Stephen Harper did. But a full-on capital F First Ministers' Conference, official cars, flag-backed lecterns and all, there's invariably but one purpose to these. For the 13 premiers to corner and harass the Prime Minister, using the imbalance in their numbers to depict the feds as the outlier. Sometimes this is in a furtherance of the premier's perennial campaign for more federal cash. Sometimes, as in the current exercise, the point seems to be conflict for conflict's sake. But always, always, it is theater. Only it is theater of a peculiar kind, with the curtains drawn and the sound down, the audience being instead entertained by periodic reports from agents for each of the actors about who said what. Thus the breathless dispatches from reporters orbiting the conference. They are kept well away from the actual meeting room. Every line of it originating from sources, federal or provincial, with a professional interest in puffing one leader or the other. Pre-conference speculation attached to which premier might storm out of the conference on what pretext. In the end, none did, but not before a lot of heavy breathing over the supposed tension and acrimony said to exist between the participants, for which we will have to take everyone's word for it. The officials inside the room and the porters outside it, each with their own interest in pretending the emotions the leaders are paid to pantomime are real. We will have to take their word for it, because the meetings are held in private. A First Minister's conference held in front of the cameras would be theater, but useful theater, as in question period or the televised election debate. There is sometimes something to be learned from direct public encounters between political rivals, when they are under pressure and at least somewhat off script. Recall Pierre Trudeau's seemingly spontaneous challenge to René Lévesque at the November 1981 First Ministers' Conference on Patriation, that they settle their differences via a nationwide referendum, and Lévesque's instant acceptance, all of it televised. That was a conference with a real agenda and real stakes. Compare that to the utter contrivance of this week's installment. The original agenda for the conference was meaty enough, the elimination of inter-provincial trade barriers. Of course, if federal-provincial conferences were likely to achieve this, the economic union would have been completed long ago. Sooner or later, it will dawn on people that leaving internal free trade to inter-provincial negotiations is the problem, not the solution. The very attempt only encourages the idea that the provinces are not part of a larger whole, with an overarching national interest to which they are obliged to defer, but little countries whose populations are as alien to one another as those of sovereign states. If the premiers were of a mind to get rid of the trade barriers, they could have carefully preserved, until now, they could have done it in a day. It would have made for a memorable meeting, but as they had no wish to do anything of the kind, they collectively changed the subject, demanding any number of other issues be put on the agenda. All of them, as it happened, matters of federal jurisdiction. So rather than discuss things over which they have some control and therefore some responsibility, the premiers demanded the meeting be given over to haranguing the feds for their failure to arrange their own affairs in a manner that the premiers might prefer. The likelihood that anything constructive would be accomplished was always near zero. The premiers are entitled to their opinion, of course, and the Trudeau government richly deserves to be criticized. Only the premiers are not elected to scrutinize federal affairs. That's what we elect a parliament for. It is to the House of Commons the federal government is accountable, not the premiers. Away with these preen fests, then. If there is some urgent public matter requiring the First Ministers to convene, fine. Otherwise, hold them in public or hold them not at all. December 12, 2018, the view up here, Canadian Glenn quotes an entire Andrew Coyne article. I think I need a shower. That's all I've got on the First Liars Conference. It's looking like there will be no official Festivus show this year. The calendar just doesn't work out. I mean, officially, Festivus is on the 23rd. That is a Sunday this year. Boxing Day is a Wednesday. It is highly unlikely there will be a show then. There will likely be one show sometime between Christmas and New Year's. On what subject, I have absolutely no idea. I do not foresee a Christmas Eve extravaganza like last year, which is good and bad. But I am considering doing some sort of year in review, not so much. I'd like to hear from people, either through the email on the website, glenn@theviewuphere.ca, or via Twitter, at Canadian Glenn. It's getting close to the end of 5 years. I have passed 45,000 total listens. I never thought this would ever happen. I'd still be doing it. But I thank everybody, and I invite them for direction, for a show, for the holiday season. And the only one I do celebrate is Festivus, so, too bad. Deal with it. Next week, I don't know. I am trying to get a show together for whenever we hear something about the proportional representation referendum in BC, but it looks like they're in no rush. We'll see what happens. But hey, if it's Wednesday, more likely than not. Studies show on Wednesdays you have a 87.5% chance that there will be an episode of The View Up Here. But that's it for tonight on the Montreal First Liars Conference. Much ado about not much. Thank you for listening to The View Up Here. We'll see you next time. Good night.